everybody, and welcome to day one of Nodevember. I do not want to be here because I tried to record this video 3 or 4 times, and now I'm just real depressed about this recording. But if there's one thing that everybody has in common when it comes to Nodevembers, nobody wants to be here. We just do it because there's this like weird sense of obligation. And for those of you who are like, the fuck are you talking about? What's Nodevember? What's he rambling about? Well, Nodevember is this monthly challenge. It's only in November. If it was January, it'd be called Node-uary. Anyways, there's a prompt. Oh, we have a member of the audience. Do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here today.
Dude, all those other Nodevember tutorials, they're out here like, yeah, I know how to connect nodes. I'll show you how to do it. So there's a prompt for every single day of the month, being November. It's one of those 30-day months, not 31 days. And the prompt for today is making a cookie procedurally, right? So that means we're not modeling, unwrapping, sculpting, fuck that. We have a sphere, and our goal is to make a cookie using procedural nodes. And you saw it's possible in that video I was playing over and over and over again. And here is the proof. This isn't me faking it. Here's the blend file, right? And you see we have the same setup where we have sphere getting bigger. By the way, you're like, wow, it's rendering so fast. How's that possible? I got a new computer. I'll make a video masturbating to like the specs later, but I'll just come all over the motherboard. Fuck it. Anyways, okay, we have a cookie. Long story short, how is this possible? Well, it's all done with procedural nodes. That's the point. Again, if we go to solid view, we do have the sphere being animated to get bigger, but then after that point, nothing happens. So right before we get into this, let me just show you specifically what it is we're going to be making. We're going to be making this node group right here. It has a bunch of math, a bunch of work for me to explain, and here's what it can do. First of all, I can control how burnt the cookie is. So here's a not burnt cookie. This is the kind of cookie you eat. This is the virgin cookie. This is like, I haven't fucked yet kind of cookie. Then we progress, and this is like, wow, I put on 2 condoms at the same time kind of cookie, and the condoms rub against each other, and it creates friction, making none of the condoms work. The chocolate's running. This tutorial makes no sense. On top of burnt, we also have the cookie height. That's how erect your cookie is. Fuck. how erect your cookie is. This is looking closer to a scone now. But whatever. You could. Why is it not updating? There we go. No, whatever. We have a slider for that. I guess it needs to be smaller than that. We also have a distortion. How distorted our cookie is. This is the kind of cookie. Dude, I feel like this is taking too long. We also can control the chocolate chips, etc. Let me show you how to make this again. This tutorial will show you all these nodes. If you want the blend file, it's going to be available on Patreon because we're not going to do the full project here. We're just going to get you pretty close. So again, word of warning, Nodevember is inherently an advanced thing. I'm not feeling good, and hopefully we can tie these things together. This is kind of like when Gon has to fight Hisoka, and Hunter x Hunter viewers will understand. So I'm going to start off with a primitive. It needs to be something close to a cookie. And you're thinking, wow, none of these are close to a cookie. And you'd be right. So I'm going to start with the sphere. Do you think that's a good choice?
Amazing.
Amazing choice, she says. Since we're going to be doing a lot of vector displacement, in other words, the procedural process of taking this shape and modeling it using nodes, vector displacement, we could use quite a bit of geometry. Control 2 to add in a subdivision level 2. It's a good level of subdivision. Level 3 might make you look like you're a bit pretentious. Control 2. Shading. Right now I'm just, not shading. I'm setting up the workspace. Not the workspace. I'm setting up the scene. So I want to do some environmental lighting. That's why I'm opening up an HDRI. HDRI stands for High Density Rotation Index, also known as High Dynamic Range Index. What? Image. It's an image that basically creates our lighting conditions, especially when we get rid of our light and use a render engine that could even, like cycles. And you can see it actually looks like our sphere is in here. Pretty cool. When are we going to get into the nodes? So right now I'm just setting everything up so that we're going to be ready, and I'm going to save out this project once we're done with it, because we're going to have to do this setup for every day of Nodevember. That's right, guys. One of these every single day. That's, they say that there's a lot of things that can cause a bad mood. One of them is being obligated to do this for 30 days, but here we are. Settings, make sure that displacement is enabled, okay? You don't want bump only, you want displacement and bump. That's right, guys. Say it with me, displacement and bump. So what I'm going to do is say it.
Displacement and bump.
Again, displacement and bump. Again,
Displacement and bump.
She's here because she's a good friend. She's like, I'm like, I need to record this today, and I'm like, I don't want to. She's like, I'll help, and I'm like, oh, thank God. I'm gonna save this as the setup because no matter what it is we're making, this is pretty much how we're gonna start. So the name of the game at this point is creating. Oh, and since we're also making a cookie out of this, and we don't want to overwrite the setup file, let me do that as well. This has to be the saddest tutorial I've ever made. This is the kind of tutorial they're gonna show at my funeral. They're like, he was sad when he was making his tutorials, and everybody's gonna be like, wow. That's fucking depressing. So name of the game is making a vector displacement kind of setup that gives us our cookie. And to do that, we're going to need to turn this, this sphere into what kind of looks like a cylinder, kind of like a pancake, pushing this down, pushing this up, kind of like a D cup to A cup kind of situation. We're going to squish it. We're going to squish it into a cookie and then kind of reshape it with some noise and stuff. So first order of business is vector displacement. This is like, when you're taking your driver's test, like put on the seatbelt and do the lights, stuff like I wouldn't know, but this is how you start vector displacement node and make sure this is set to object space coordinates. Just a very quick intro in case you're kind of a vector displacement newbie. This is going to be a list of vector instructions, so it's not going to be based off a normal. It's not displacing along the normal like a displacement map. We're going to be displacing along a arbitrary vector. So we could displace every single point on the sphere by the x-axis or along the x-axis. And then the y, which you can't see because we're in the side view. But rest assured, it was moving. Whew. I feel like I need a burp, but I can't. Also on the z-axis, etc. You probably wouldn't input a single vector into here normally, but a map, which is what we're going to create. So we need to create some kind of setup that goes into the vector displacement that creates a cookie. To do this, we are going to start off with some not texture coordinates, but really geometry coordinates. Interesting thing about vector displacement is the texture coordinates, at least generated coordinates, flow with it, whereas the position doesn't, because it just outputs the XYZ position of the sphere. Who would have thought? Thank God you're watching this tutorial. You wouldn't have been able to figure that out yourself. I'm going to separate this by X, Y, and Z components because we only care about the Z component, the Z gradient, where we want the top hemisphere to be pushed down and the bottom hemisphere to be pushed up. To do that, we need to give instructions to Blender saying, hey, oi, Blender, how much should you displace by, right? And this is what this map range is going to do. We're saying take the Z coordinates, take the input interval 0 to 1, in other words, ground level, Z equals 0 to 1. This is all negative down here. And output the interval 0, 1. This is going to be our displacement amount. And we could just set it up that way before we even get into the nitty gritty. This is like the first 5 minutes of math class when they're like, kind of showing you the lay of the land before they actually teach the lesson. At least in my school, that's what they did. This is how you make an egg. What's happening here is the top part that had texture coordinates, let me disconnect this, had texture coordinates 1 is being displaced by 1, and this is being displaced by 0. Basically, it's being displaced by the very gradient that you're seeing. Of course, we don't want that. We're just going to bring this down until it's actually caving in, so that's a negative number. And you're going to see that the color goes away, so you can just do that to actually see what's going on. We're going to be displacing by a negative amount. Again, and you might not really be understanding mathematically what's going on here, but you do understand sliders changing, so that's good. And again, it's only affecting the top hemisphere because we're taking the input interval 0 to 1. Was it 0 to 1? Was that the interval?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Apparently it was. We can also, yeah?
I have no idea.
Listen, I don't know what's going on here either. I literally, I'm just talking over somebody else's footage. Somebody else records this tutorial. I'm like narrating best I can. I'm very good at it. It's like Girl Gone Gamer situation for those of you who know what that is. To take care of the bottom hemisphere, it's 0 to -1 interval. So let's make that -1. And similarly to before, we're just going to give this instructions for the displacement. Of course, we can kind of have either one or the other. So here, we can have the bottom half. You could kind of either have one or the other. Whoops, what have I done? So here's the bottom and here's the top. But somehow we want to include both kind of sets of instructions. And in life, where you want to do two things at once, what are you doing? You are taking one and adding it to the other. We're saying take one set of instructions and add it to another. Of course, there's a mathematical explanation for what's going on here, but now we have a vector displacement procedural approach to give us a very rounded cookie. This is the kind of cookie you get in a centrifuge. It's like perfectly round, and of course that's not going to be, ideal. So next order of business is adding in a bit of noise, and then we're actually going to have the general shape. There's not much more work we're going to need to do to this. By the way, we don't need all these files. Don't want you seeing my not a porn folder. To add a noise, what we're going to do is literally add in a noise texture, which is going to drive our noise kind of displacement. To make sense, because we don't have to do any extra work. It's right there. And we're not going to be dealing with the factor. Let's deal with the color that has X, Y, and Z data, not just the same thing for X, Y, and Z. We want to take this and somehow combine it with this list of instructions and then send it through vector displacement. And again, what did we talk about, friends? When you want to take two instructions and put them together, you are? Adding them. Get up close. Whisper it. The guys don't get enough. Yeah? Adding, dude. I swear to God. And none of these viewers have ever even touched a girl, seen a girl. I'm the closest they have to a father figure. Okay? I'm their daddy. Okay? She's telling me to continue. Okay. Vector math. We're just going to put this in here and add. The answer was add these two ideas together. Okay? So you can see right now what we have is, again, the scenario you would expect. We have a cookie that is, let's actually see the BSDF. That is displaced. This is actually looking like crumpled paper in its own right. It's looking pretty cool. We've added these ideas together, but you've probably noticed, let me just disconnect this and then reconnect it. Not only does it add it, but it's shifting everything up by 0.5, the vector 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. You can see it's like moving up. And like there's an explanation for this. But long story short, what's happening here is noise texture outputs a value between 0 and 1, at least in a vector sense in every component, for every point on the surface. In other words, every point on the surface has a vector that's between 0 and 1 on each component, which means on average, you're getting 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Because if you get a bunch of numbers between 0 and 1 on average, they're going to be 0.5 if they're uniformly distributed. That's just a fact of life. Which means that on average, everything's being displaced by the vector 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. So what do? We correct for this by adding negative 0.5, negative 0.5, negative 0.5, or subtracting the vector, more simply, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Okay? So now we've recentered this, and you're thinking, okay, it's looking good, but, this is looking like somebody who's taken a bit of a beating, right? It's not looking like a cookie. This is the kind of cookie that's gone through like childhood trauma and like, I don't know, right? It's too much. So what we're going to do is let's actually scale, and not this scale, not like the size of the noise, even though that kind of looks like it's working and making a cookie, right? Let's actually scale the strength of this incoming vector, okay? To do this, and I'm already feeling better. It's weird. Like this tutorial is what was making me feel worse before, but now it's making me feel better. Blender giveth and taketh. You can see that this scale is now affecting the strength of the noise, but then of course, the drifting is somehow introduced back. And that's because, again, the correction vector was, negative 0.5, negative 0.5, negative 0.5, but that was assuming that this number was 1. If it's anything else, we need to correct for that as well. So let's actually scale by, again, the same kind of vector, this 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 that is being subtracted, but whatever we use for the strength of our noise, let's do a equally large correction in the value. It makes sense, You giveth, you taketh, you fill the hole. There's a scene about this in Stand and Deliver. So if we have 0, there's going to be no noise and no correction vector. If it's 1, we have the same thing as before, but anything in between. And it's starting to look just a tiny bit, if you really squint your eyes, dude. It's really starting to look like a cookie, especially if we add in a bit more geometry, okay? And if you kind of don't want it to be as messy, but still, well, let me put it like this. If you want to have a lot more X and Y, like radial, like this kind of view, distortion, but not this crinkly effect, what you can do is you can actually mess with, each coordinate individually. So I'm just going to do this very quickly. I'm going to multiply this by 1, 1, 0. So now you can see it's the same kind of distortion as before, but now like it's kind of looking like a UFO. There's no distortion going up and down. But then, of course, we have this issue with the correction vector. You already know the story, so we are going to scale by 0. And now I think this should work. Yes. So now we have a setup that adds noise but keeps everything in place, and you want to pick a value that's pretty small. So I'm just going to choose something like that. And I know it's not looking too much like a cookie, but you add in a bit of, the material. I mean, I guess it's all material, but you add in some color and stuff like this, and it's actually going to start looking pretty good. So before we continue, let me just add in a bit more form. Again, we can control everything from before. It's all mathematical. All the steps aren't baked in. Get it? Baked like wheat, no, like a cookie, right? All the steps, they're not baked in. You can just kind of go back and do a tutorial and drink water at the same time. You hear that, listeners? This is exhausting work. Okay, so now we have the general shape of the cookie. Rest of the name of the game is creating chocolate chips. What is a cookie without some chocolate chips? So to do this, it's disgusting. You could do a bunch of, math to do this, or you could just use a Voronoi texture. Voronoi texture, it used to be called the chocolate chip node, but then after 2.9 came out, they renamed it to Voronoi texture. And basically, again, it's the chocolate chip node. It has that functionality. So, you have your chocolate chips, but you got to say, where are those chocolate chips? So you just bump up the contrast, because you got to have pretty good vision to see what's going on here. So here we've already created a basic map for chocolate chips. Of course, you could get a bit more complicated, like should the chocolate chips be a bit distorted? Should they be on the bottom? Well, our audience member here does quite a bit of baking, so let me ask a question. When you are making a cookie, in my head, the chocolate chips are only on the top. Is that because I'm sprinkling on the chocolate chips, or is it because, or in the other case, does the dough already come with chocolate chips in there? Yeah?
The chocolate chips are everywhere.
They're everywhere. Okay,
yeah.
so in my render, I didn't put them in the bottom, so change the narrative.
None. Well, they're more pronounced on the top, yeah, because the bottom.
Okay, so let's have less on the bottom. How about
Correct.
that? Well, I don't know how to do that, so let's just have none on the bottom. We'll go with that. That was the correct answer. So you might be thinking, oh, let's do the same kind of situation from before where we actually use the Z map. This is actually isolating top and bottom. And you might be thinking, and I'll show you the issue with this in a second. You might be thinking, take this kind of chocolate chip map, that's what we're going to call it from now on, and multiply it by this. In other words, kind of only reveal. And let's actually invert this so the chocolate chips are white, just so it has a bit more readability. So we might be saying, okay, only put the chocolate chips here, or we could still play around with the size of this and everything, and not on the bottom. The issue with this, with using the Z coordinate from the position, is if you then scale this, or maybe it's not an issue. It's kind of looking like it's working. You know what? It does work, but if we were to do more to this, it would introduce a couple issues, I think. So what I'm going to do is just forget that. I think it might work, but instead we're going to go with my method. This is the kind of thing where it's your grandpa learned it this way, so I guess that's what you're going to learn. We're going to use texture coordinates, and we're going to use generated coordinates, because interestingly enough, the way this works with vector displacement is even though the position vectors, let's actually view those, even though these position vectors are kind of changing as we do this, right, because we have different locations for this. At least I think that's how it works. The interesting thing is that generated coordinates, if you imagine, wow, I am at a loss for words. If you imagine that the generated coordinates are kind of wrapped on top of here, they actually move with the displacement, right? It's actually they're mapped onto there, which in this case it's useful because we can have and this is using, by the way, this is using generated coordinates. We just don't need to put it in here. It's just kind of inherent to the thing. Because it's mapped to that, I think you understand what I'm saying. These circles move with the deformation is the point. They don't change. Whereas if we used a different kind of coordinate system, it would. Long story short, and that was a very long story. Long story short, we're going to use the Z coordinates from this generated coordinates, which we're going to multiply right here. Let's actually have this go all the way. And kind of going with this idea that they exist on the bottom, but just not as strong. You know what? We'll adapt. What we could do is let's just add. We're going to add this right here. So again, this is what we're looking at this time. It moves with the deformation, so the bottom of the sphere is going to be 0, and then we go up to 1. If we add, and we can view this right here, like a negative number, you can see we're kind of making a gradient that moves from the bottom of the cookie towards the middle and the top, okay? But when we view it here, it can kind of be like the strength of our chocolate chip. So they kind of exist in some places, but not others. Another way to do this is using a power function. So you could have it be more of a fall off, and maybe that's what we'll do. Just so they exist, but they're kind of very faint, okay? So now we have our chocolate chip map, and I'm just gonna, like, the nice thing about this is we can always, like, change it on the fly, and maybe we'll talk about that in a second. One more thing I want to do to our chocolate chip map, the same way that we distorted the shape of the cookie, I also want to distort the chocolate chips. These chocolate chips are going to come out deformed. That's what we're doing. So exact same idea, literally. Noise texture, and then what? Vector math, because you want to add in the noise. Whoops, don't do what I just did. You want to add in the noise. You want to say how strong is the noise? Well, it's going to be as strong as the scale is going to be. But then, like before, we need to do a correction kind of term. So we subtract by 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, but we're too smart for that. We already know that we're going to need a scale again. So we just kind of put this in here. And now you can see everything's showing up. Everything kind of drifted away before, but we brought it back, kind of like a kite that's trying to get away, or maybe I have a joke in my head. It might be a bit too much. I'm getting the no. We're gonna skip over that one. But listen, if you know what I'm talking about, that's your fucking problem. Okay, you came up with that. You're the filthy one. So here we have a strength of 0, and then we can increase, and maybe you're not seeing it much. Let's actually increase detail, which will be visible once we increase the strength. Now you can see that we have chocolate chips that have a bit more texture to them because they're being distorted. Of course, you don't want it to be too much. And then you can also control the frequency of this kind of operation. Okay, let's see. What else? I'm thinking the only other thing I want to mess with is this is like the kind of chocolate chip cookie you give to like a sugar addict. There's too much going on here. So let's actually just, it's either this way or the other way. Yeah, this way. This is basically, again, this is the contrast of our Voronoi map, which is, there's a whole technical explanation, but when you shift these to the left, you get smaller chips. When you shift them to the right, you get bigger chips, which, you could actually make its own node. You could do a math add situation where you could add, add tininess. You could shrink, or you could enlarge it. So that's just a thing you could do. I'm going to set that at 0. Okay, so what do we have? We have vector displacement that gives us a cookie, and then we have a mask that currently we're not doing anything with. Two things we want to do with this. One, we want to say those areas of the cookie, make them higher, right? Chocolate chips are higher than the cookies, is that right? Just a little bit. I'm hearing from my sources, just a little bit. And then we also want to change the color and the shininess and stuff like that too. Okay, so first of all, then this is kind of like, this is the kind of thing where I'm like, I don't actually expect you to get this, but just try, okay? Like, you're smart. So all the vector displacement we did before was kind of based on just this arbitrary XYZ vector. We could also do normal displacement included in our vector displacement, right? Along the normal, this idea that you're probably already used to. How? Well, instead of using like this position vector, you could literally use normals. So here's the normals. They're looking very confusing. By the way, they can be smoothed out if you do shade smooth. So it's a bit confusing what's going on here. Let's go back to position. This is, again, the XYZ location that we mess with just to do some transforms. But normal literally says which direction is each face. Say it with me, facing. That's why they're called faces. Now you know. That's some etymology. Okay, let's finish this up. What we want to do is add in a bit of a normal direction vector displacement wherever we have exactly this map. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some vector math addition because we want to include more stuff. We are going to include what? We're going to include the normal vector, put that in there, which is going to literally enlarge it because everything's kind of going outwards, which is exactly what scaling is. We're going to say scale it by how much? By a certain amount, right? So now we have control over this. So here's 0, and here's it expanding. There's a fetish for this. And what you could say is you don't want to do this everywhere. You say you only want to do it wherever you have your white mapping. Let's just clamp that just in case. Boom. There you go. End of the tutorial. Now you know how to make a crystal cave. This is the kind of chocolate chip cookie you give to, like, dude, what is this? Come on, come up with a joke. Me, I don't know either. This is the kind of chocolate chip cookie you give to somebody who, like, is too young to go to, like, a sex shop. How about that? We'll go with that. Make something sexual. It's always funny. That's the, oh, by the way, you might be thinking, why are the outward crystals in some sense like smaller than the, the ones towards the top? And again, that's because of our power mapping, right? So we literally control the fall off of these. That's another interesting thing. Either way, we want to scale it again by the scale value, but not make it as intense. So I'm just going to multiply the multiplication. It gets crazy. But if we multiply by 0, it has no height. And if we multiply it by just a bit, it has a tiny bit of height. And you just want to be like, maybe you could help me here. Is that right, or is that too tall?
Too tall.
That's too tall. Let's go like half. And I do want it to be a bit exaggerated, just so there's a tiny bit going on.
Good.
And also, I'm not liking how much fall off there is, so let's make it a little less intense. There we go. Okay, so again, we should have very few on the bottom, which I think makes sense.
It does.
Okay, cool. So now we have the shape of chocolate chips that don't really exist there, but they're there. You can kind of tell where they should be. So there's a tiny bit more we could do with vector displacement, but now the rest of the game, and this is the fun part because it's so easy. This is kind of like when you went through high school and you hate it, but then you're like senior year, as long as you have a good GPA, you kind of don't have, I feel like that's more college, right? High school, you kind of have to do the best you can every year, or they kind of kick you out of, right?
Nah.
No? Yeah, I feel like you could fuck off every year of high school and they'll let you pass, at least in America.
No child left behind?
No child left behind. That's the policy I take with these tutorials, except we're leaving all the children behind. Nobody's making it this far. So what do we want to do? What we want to do is take our cookie and give it some color. How do we want to give it color? Like, how do we know where the chocolate chips are? If only there was a very convenient... What is that? It tells us exactly where they are supposed to be. And in fact, we could add in a bit more control for this, but I'm not in the mood. So I'm not gonna. What we're gonna do is we're gonna connect this to the base color so that the cookie is one color and the chocolate chips are another. Of course, this is the kind of cookie that's very moldy. So let's add in some color ramp. So we could say the black should be one color, like, I don't know, some kind of cookie color. We'll mess with that in a bit. And then the chocolate chips should be that, but way darker, kind of like nearly black. And then if we bring this inwards, we've kind of, it doesn't look as good as my original yet, but we could get there. We've isolated the chocolate chips and made them black. And one trick is if you set this to B-spline, you get a nicer, you get a nicer interpolation fall off. And we can mess with the original here to get a different kind of spread. And again, remember, since it's all driven by Voronoi, here we go. Voronoi, you could literally, let's add in 4-dimensional noise. You could literally move these chocolate chips along the surface and pick a cookie that you like. So I did this quite a bit until I got one that looked appetizing. Right now, this looks like a piece of plastic. So let's give it a better color. I think it needs to be like this, but like less saturated and way brighter. It's kind of hard to tell. This is a good start. What makes it look real is not only color, but then also roughness and bump and stuff like that. So let's deal with that as well. For that, let's see what we got here. Basically, we have a shininess map that we could use. So let's throw on another color ramp and connect this to the roughness. Now, in my experience, the cookie part of the cookie, so here you can see the issue. It's so shiny. The cookie part of, I have something in my nose. I'm trying to get it out. It's really lodged in there. I don't think it's gonna happen. It feels so weird to talk. Either way, I found that the cookie part of the cookie, which I think in this case is black, is very rough. So we want to say wherever it's black, in other words, wherever there's cookie, make it close to 1, a high roughness, a low amount of like light bounce that doesn't get trapped, right? So I'm just going to pick a high value, and then for the chocolate chips, depending on like how melted they are, they're going to end up actually being pretty shiny, so closer to 0, which is a perfectly reflective surface. So now you can see the cookie's kind of rough, and if we get the light just right, the chocolate chips are kind of shiny, which is nice. Another thing we could do just to give this a lot more texture, because it's looking very flat, and maybe this is a good time to use that addition slider. Nah, that ain't it, Chief. That ain't it. Well, we'll talk about the chocolate chip placement later. Another thing we could do is add in some bump mapping, because right now this is looking very, very plain. So just add in a bump node and put that in the normal socket, because we're going to convert some basic factor information, some like fake height information into bump mapping that can be used as a normal map. What are we going to use for that? Well, a couple things. Let's start off with a noise. And by the way, every time you add in a noise, your node network gets a bit slower, okay? It does. That's just, it does. Don't argue with me. It does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this noise texture, make it bigger. I think my point was, like, you could reuse a noise from before, but I'm not going to. We're going to make this very fine, kind of like the fine porous detail of the cookie. We're going to connect that into the height. And let's see what that's looking like so far. So, like, it's not looking good, not gonna lie, but you can see, like, this does add a tiny bit of detail. So how do we make it look better? First of all, it should be smaller, I think. And another thing is maybe it shouldn't have as much of an impact. So instead of changing the strength, let's just actually multiply this before it even reaches this. So 0 means don't do anything. Or no, this is addition. 0 means don't do anything. 1 means maximum, or I guess we could go way above maximum. I'm just going to set this to something like 0.5. Another thing to consider is I guess you should have that not apply wherever there are chocolate chips. So you can see here we have our fine detail, and it's like, wow, this is looking weird. You don't want it to be wherever there's a chocolate chip. So we could literally just subtract away this map because we're subtracting away wherever there's white. It works out very nicely. So subtract what? Subtract our chocolate chip map using clamping. And then we have same thing as before, we have the bumpiness, but not so much wherever we have chocolate chip. Nice. Couple more things. Let's add in a bit of, and again, we could use Voronoi from before. I'm just going to use a new one. I'm just going to add some cracks along the cookie. Again, I'm not doing anything too nice here. This is just kind of theory behind how you do it. So here's kind of like the cracks you could have in a cookie, and you can mess with like different algorithms and stuff. I don't know. This is a good way to quickly get it, and then again, to include it in the bump with the other stuff, you do the same thing as always, you add. And I'm just going to connect this to this, and let's view it. So now we're going to have a bit of a broken up cookie. It's not seeming to show it too harshly, so we could add in a bit of contrast. So just move this over. But that should be super intense. Okay, let's see what this is looking like. Yeah, so now you can see it, again, it's starting to get that crinkled look, but as always, if you make it less intense, it should make it look better. So let's scale this by like 0.3, just so it's barely there. So at this point, we have a very, I mean, by very, I mean completely. I don't know what it is with very. I'm going crazy, dude. Do you want to wrap up this tutorial? No. Yes?
I have no idea. No.
Oh, well, I do. Wow, these chocolate chips are a little too shiny, in my opinion. Let's do a quick fix for that. Where's our roughness map? This one, increase it. Boop. And I'm also thinking that maybe we went a bit too much on the this one. Let's bring it down. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I feel like I've lost my train of thought. So what we have is a completely procedural setup that, again, is just a sphere. We do some stuff to it, and it looks like we didn't take care of the displacement for the chocolate chips, but whatever, that's fine. It makes the cookie, when we set this to 1, we can move around the chocolate chips. Where's the chips? Where are the chips? Here they are. And you can also control the amount of chips you have with the scale and addition just to make them slightly bigger. And you can just kind of play with this until you have a chocolate chip cookie that you like. And then again, a couple other small things. These things have a tiny bit of subsurface scattering, like light going through them. That's kind of what makes it look appetizing. So just give it a bit of subsurface, set up a basic scene with a plane, and make sure that it's going under the cookie, so it's not being like cut through. And then to make things look appetizing, you want to use, it's really just color choice what makes it look appetizing. So right now this might look, it kind of looks close to edible. Would you say that looks edible?
I do.
Yeah, it doesn't look, I wouldn't say it looks tasty. This is like the kind of cookie where like, yeah, take it or leave it, right? Like, would you take that cookie, or is it just kind of like?
I mean, if it, you know me. If
I know
it's a
you.
cookie, I'll take it.
Okay, so it's okay, but it's looking real in some sense, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so really, name of the game is just making it look appetizing at this point. So the floor, I'm just gonna give it a color that's kind of warm and inviting, kind of cookie-like. So instead of white, we have this kind of pastel pink situation. In your camera view, you just want to zoom in a lot, just like that, because again, it's a very small object. You increase this, you say, I don't want to see all this stuff in the background, so let's do the viewport trick. Where is it? Pass-through part out, increase that, and then you just want to pick a good camera angle, because right now it's looking trash. So just kind of move around the camera until you get the best view of your cookie where it looks like the most edible. For me, again, I didn't spend that much time on this node network as compared to the original, so it's not going to look as good, but I did do this process of looking for an appetizing angle. I think this looks kind of edible. Okay, so we're just going to put this here. You know what? I feel like I keep flip-flopping on this. Whatever, we're going to put it here. You could spend all day doing this. And then maybe a couple final touches. Depth of field. This is the depth object. Make it very shallow depth of field. It's 0.1. That's crazy, right? Yeah. A lot of that's out of focus. Set that to 1. You could do some compositing. But long story short, we could keep talking about this forever. The rest of this is really color choice. Oh, actually, let me do one more thing before we close out of here. Because this does actually add quite a bit of realism. Last thing is, how do we give this a bit of texture, like making it look like it's more cooked in some areas than others. So I'll go over that and then we're going to be done. You can see we added yet another noise, and you can think of this as like effectively random for where it's going to be burnt and not. And then this is a super easy trick, and it's nice that it actually works so well. You mix RGB, you multiply. In other words, let's multiply it by black. So I'm going to say I'm going to darken it because we're multiplying by black where corresponding to this factor. Okay, and then we can also have control. Actually, you know what? We can actually multiply directly by this. So that now, this probably makes more sense. So that now you can have a perfectly fine cookie or one that's burnt in some areas and some that is not burnt. So this is just a quick way to kind of change how baked it is. And maybe you could pull around the slider until you find like one that looks more believable, but that's just a nice trick. Anyways, this is kind of like the essence of how you do some basic vector math. So again, the most important part of this tutorial was like the last part. Here's our sphere, it's getting cut through, and then we animate it so it looks like that. You put in a lot more work, and believe me, you're gonna notice that the result that I have, it ain't too different. Of course, I spent more time kind of giving it more like, cookie dough colors. I think the, let's set this to repeat. I think the chocolate chips look a bit better because I kind of spent more time making it look like they're kind of jutting out at weird angles and stuff like that. But again, there's nothing here we didn't go over. So anyways, I think that is the essence of it. The original blend file is going to be on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, if you want access to exclusive tutorials, behind the scenes blend files like this one, as along with some other stuff like Discord access, stuff like that, Patreon is the best place to do that. I want to thank 500 some people who are part of that, because like, fuck, like I don't know how many people get to make a living talking about cookies. So, there you go. Anyways, that's been it. Thank you for sitting in. Thanks. Yeah, that's the show. See ya. Bye.